Standing in my childhood home surrounded by extended family, I watched my father's face turn red with rage as he screamed those words that would change everything. "You will never amount to anything, Scarlett." The room fell silent. Aunts, uncles, cousins, all staring. But instead of tears, something cold and calculating settled in my chest. I smiled calmly and said, "Watch me." What happened next exposed a web of lies, stolen inheritance, and family betrayal that destroyed everything they thought they knew about our perfect family dynasty. Hey everyone! Before we dive into this absolutely wild family revenge story, I am so curious. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you are ready for some serious family drama that will have you questioning everything about loyalty and blood ties, smash that like button and hit subscribe, because this story has more twists than a pretzel factory. Trust me, you will want to see how this ends. My name is Scarlett Montgomery, and until that devastating family dinner, I believed I was the disappointment of the Montgomery legacy. Growing up in Charleston, South Carolina, our family was old money, the kind that came with expectations, trust funds, and a reputation to maintain. My father, Richard Montgomery, ran the family's real estate empire that had been passed down for 4 generations. My mother, Eleanor, played the perfect Southern belle wife, hosting charity galas and maintaining our family's social standing. For 28 years, I had been told I was not good enough. While my younger brother, Mason, was groomed to take over the business, I was constantly reminded of my failures. I dropped out of business school to pursue art therapy, which my father called a hobby for the weak-minded. When I opened my own practice helping trauma survivors, he dismissed it as playing with crayons. Every family gathering became a performance where Mason was the star, and I was the cautionary tale. But that night, everything started to unravel when my grandmother's will was finally read. Grandmother Rose had passed away 3 months earlier, and the family had been waiting for the formal reading of her will. She had always been my champion, the only one who believed in my dreams. While everyone else saw my career choice as frivolous, she understood that helping people heal was my calling. During her final weeks, she had pulled me aside and whispered, "Scarlett, honey, I have made sure you will be taken care of. You have always been my favorite, though I could never show it." The lawyer, Mr. Harrison, sat at the head of our mahogany dining table as the entire Montgomery clan gathered. Aunts Patricia and Margaret with their judgmental stares. Uncle Charles with his perpetual smirk. My cousins, who had always treated me like the family black sheep, and of course my parents and Mason, all expecting the bulk of the estate to flow through traditional channels. To my granddaughter, Scarlett Montgomery. Mr. Harrison read his voice steady and professional. "I leave my entire personal estate, including the antique collection jewelry and the downtown Charleston property portfolio valued at approximately $4.2 million. The room erupted. My father's face went from confusion to pure rage in seconds. "That is impossible. Mother always said the family assets would stay with the men of the family. There has to be a mistake." But Mr. Harrison continued. "Additionally, Mrs. Montgomery left specific instructions that this bequest comes with documentation she kept in her private safe, which is to be given directly to Miss Scarlett." My hands shook as I accepted the sealed envelope. Inside were photocopied bank statements, property deeds, and a letter in my grandmother's elegant handwriting that made my blood run cold. "My dearest Scarlett," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then the truth must finally come to light. Your father has been stealing from the family trust for over 15 years. He has been selling properties that belonged to your grandfather's estate and pocketing the money. The downtown properties I am leaving you are the only ones he has not managed to liquidate yet. He thinks I am a foolish old woman who does not pay attention to business matters, but I have been watching. I have kept copies of everything." The letter continued with devastating details. My father had been forging my grandfather's signature on property transfers years after his death. He had created fake companies to hide the sales, The family fortune everyone believed we still possessed was largely gone spent on my father's gambling addiction and my mother's excessive shopping habits that she hid from everyone. But the most crushing revelation was yet to come. Scarlett, there is something else you must know. The college fund your father claimed was empty because of your poor grades never existed. The money for your education was spent on Mason's private school tuition and your parents' European vacations. Every time your father told you there was no money for your dreams, he was lying. I have the bank records proving he withdrew funds designated for your future. I looked up from the letter to find my entire family staring at me. My father's jaw was clenched so tightly I could see the muscles twitching. Whatever poison mother wrote in that letter, it is nothing but the ramblings of a bitter old woman. Scarlett, you know how confused she became in her final months. But I had seen the documentation. Bank statements showing withdrawals of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Property records with forged signatures. Email communications between my father and buyers discussing properties that should have required family approval to sell. Mason, who had been silent throughout the reading, finally spoke up. Dad, what is she talking about? What gambling addiction? My mother's perfectly composed facade began to crack. Richard, tell them this is all nonsense. But my father's silence spoke volumes. Instead of denying the accusations, he turned his fury on me. You ungrateful little bitch. After everything we have done for you, after putting up with your failures and disappointments for years, you are going to believe the vindictive lies of a dead woman. That was when he stood up, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor, and screamed those words that would echo in my mind forever. You will never amount to anything, Scarlett. You are weak. You are pathetic, and you will squander whatever money Mother left you, just like you have squandered every opportunity we have given you. The entire room was frozen in shocked silence. My aunts covered their mouths in horror. My cousins looked uncomfortable, suddenly finding their phones very interesting. Mason stared at our father like he was seeing a stranger. But something had shifted inside me. Years of believing I was not good enough. Years of accepting their narrative that I was the family failure, years of apologizing for existing, suddenly crystallized into perfect cold clarity. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope along with the bank statements and property records. Then I looked directly at my father and smiled the most genuine smile I had felt in years. Watch me, I said quietly, but my voice carried across the silent room like a challenge. The next morning, I sat in the law offices of Harrison and Associates with my grandmother's documents spread across the mahogany conference table. Mr. Harrison, a distinguished gentleman in his 60s, who had been the family lawyer for decades, reviewed each piece of evidence with the careful attention of someone who had seen enough family scandals to last several lifetimes. Miss Montgomery, he said, removing his reading glasses and folding his hands. What your grandmother documented here constitutes serious financial fraud. These forged signatures alone could result in criminal charges and the misappropriation of trust funds. He paused, studying my face carefully. Are you prepared for what pursuing this might mean for your family? I thought about that question for a long moment. 24 hours ago, I would have backed down, would have found some way to excuse my father's behavior, or convince myself that keeping the peace was more important than seeking justice. But something fundamental had changed when he humiliated me in front of our entire extended family. The daughter who desperately craved his approval had died in that dining room, and in her place sat a woman who finally understood that some people do not deserve forgiveness just because they share your DNA. Mr. Harrison, I replied, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to unleash. My father spent my entire life telling me I would never be strong enough to handle real responsibility. He convinced everyone, including me, that I was too soft, too emotional, too naive for the business world. I think it is time to prove him wrong. He nodded slowly, a hint of admiration in his eyes. Very well. I will need to bring in a forensic accountant to examine the full scope of the financial irregularities. We should also contact the district attorney's office about the forged documents. But Miss Montgomery, I want you to understand that once we start this process, there will be no going back. Your father will likely face criminal charges. Good, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. Actions have consequences. Over the next 3 weeks, I threw myself into the investigation with an intensity that shocked everyone who knew me. The forensic accountant, a sharp-eyed woman named Rebecca Torres, uncovered a pattern of financial manipulation that went back even further than my grandmother had suspected. My father had not just been stealing from the family trust, he had been systematically draining accounts, selling properties without proper authorization, and creating shell companies to hide his activities for over 2 decades. But the most devastating discovery came when Rebecca found evidence that my father had been lying about the family's financial status to my mother and brother as well. While they lived lavishly believing the family fortune was secure, my father had been desperately juggling debts and borrowing against properties to maintain their lifestyle. The Charleston mansion we lived in had been mortgaged 3 times. The luxury cars, the country club memberships, the expensive vacations. All of it financed by stolen money and mounting debt. During this time, my relationship with Mason became increasingly strained. He called me repeatedly, sometimes angry, sometimes pleading, begging me to stop this madness and think about the family reputation. But I had learned something crucial during my years as a therapist. Enabling destructive behavior is not love. It is cowardice dressed up as loyalty. "Scarlett, you are destroying everything Dad built," Mason said during one particularly heated phone call. "Do you really hate us so much that you would rather see the family name dragged through the mud than just let this go?" "Mason," I replied, feeling surprisingly calm despite his emotional manipulation. "Dad did not build anything. He stole everything. And I do not hate you. I am trying to save you from being complicit in his crimes." But Mason was not ready to hear the truth. None of them were. My mother called me crying, begging me to reconsider. "Think about your poor father's health, Scarlett. Think about how this stress could affect his heart condition." The heart condition that he had never mentioned during any of his screaming fits directed at me over the years I noted silently. My aunts and uncles began reaching out as well, each call following the same script. First came the guilt. How could I betray family like this? Then came the bribes. Surely we could work something out privately. Finally came the threats. If I persisted with this vindictive behavior, I would be cut off from the family forever. "Promise me something, Miss Montgomery," Rebecca Torres said during one of our weekly meetings as she reviewed bank statements that showed my father had liquidated my college fund to cover gambling debts in Atlantic City. "Promise me you will not let them guilt you into backing down. I have seen this pattern before in family financial fraud cases. The perpetrator becomes the victim, and the actual victim gets painted as the villain for speaking up." She was right, and I could already see it happening. Social media posts from cousins about family loyalty and forgiveness. Whispered conversations at church that I could feel but not quite hear. Former family friends who suddenly seemed uncomfortable when they saw me around town. But I had one unexpected ally. My grandmother's longtime housekeeper, Miss Dorothy, who had worked for our family for 30 years. She called me a week after the will reading, her voice shaking with emotion. "Miss Scarlett, I need to tell you something I probably should have said years ago. I saw things, honey. I saw your daddy going through Miss Rose's papers when she was napping. I saw him taking documents from her safe. And I heard him on the phone with those gambling people threatening him about money he owed." Miss Dorothy agreed to provide a sworn statement about what she had witnessed. Her testimony would be crucial in establishing a pattern of behavior and proving that my grandmother's mental faculties had been sharp enough to document the evidence she had gathered. As the investigation deepened, I began to see my father's psychological manipulation with crystal clarity. He had not just stolen money. He had stolen my confidence, my sense of self-worth, and my belief in my own capabilities. Every time he told me I was not smart enough for business, he was protecting himself from the possibility that I might discover his crimes. Every time he dismissed my career achievements, he was diminishing my credibility, so that if I ever did speak up, no one would take me seriously. But the most insidious part of his manipulation was how he had turned the entire family against me before I even knew there was a war being fought. Years of subtle comments about my emotional instability and tendency toward dramatics had planted seeds that would make it easier to discredit me if his crimes ever came to light. The realization was both liberating and heartbreaking. I was not the problem. I had never been the problem. I was the threat he had spent decades trying to neutralize. 3 months after that fateful family dinner, I sat across from District Attorney Sarah Chen in her downtown Charleston office watching her review the mountain of evidence Rebecca Torres and I had compiled. The forensic accounting report alone was over 200 pages detailing a sophisticated scheme of financial fraud that had stolen nearly $8 million from family trusts' estate accounts and investment funds over the past 20 years. Miss Montgomery, District Attorney Chen, said, her expression grave as she closed the final folder. This is one of the most comprehensive cases of family financial fraud I have seen in my 15 years as a prosecutor. Your father did not just steal money. He created an elaborate criminal enterprise designed to systematically loot generational wealth while maintaining the appearance of successful family leadership. The evidence painted a picture of calculated deception that went far beyond simple greed. My father had established multiple shell companies with names similar to legitimate family businesses. He had forged signatures on property deeds, created fake invoices for non-existent construction projects, and even established fraudulent investment accounts that existed only on paper to show my mother and brother when they asked about family finances. But perhaps the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source: my father's own records. During the investigation, we discovered that he had kept detailed notes about his gambling activities, apparently believing he could track his way back to profitability. These notes, found in his home office safe, provided a clear timeline of how stolen family money had been funneled directly to casinos in Atlantic City, Las Vegas, and illegal offshore gambling websites. The irony Rebecca Torres had pointed out during our last meeting is that his obsessive record-keeping, probably intended to help him manage his addiction, became the smoking gun that proves criminal intent. He knew exactly where the money was coming from and where it was going. District Attorney Chen leaned back in her chair, studying me carefully. Miss Montgomery, I want you to understand that proceeding with criminal charges will likely destroy your father financially and could result in significant prison time. Are you absolutely certain you want to pursue this course of action? The question hung in the air like a challenge. I thought about the phone calls I had been receiving from family members, each one more desperate than the last. Mason had shown up at my apartment the previous week, tears streaming down his face as he begged me to reconsider. "Scarlett, please," he had said, his voice breaking. "I know Dad made mistakes, but prison? Think about what this will do to Mom. Think about what this will do to all of us." But I had also been thinking about something else. The clients in my therapy practice who had suffered years of abuse and manipulation from family members who used love as a weapon and guilt as a tool of control. How many times had I counseled someone to set boundaries with toxic family members? How often had I explained that enabling destructive behavior is not compassion, but complicity? "District Attorney Chen," I said, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to confirm. My father spent my entire life convincing me that I was weak, that I was not capable of handling difficult situations, that I would crumble under pressure. He used my love for our family as a weapon against me, knowing I would always choose peace over justice. But he miscalculated. The daughter who would have protected him at any cost died the night he humiliated me in front of our entire family. The woman sitting here today understands that some people forfeit the right to family loyalty when they choose to be predators instead of protectors. The criminal charges were filed on a Tuesday morning in November. The local newspaper ran the story with a headline that made my heart race: "Prominent Charleston family patriarch charged with multiple felonies in financial fraud scheme." By noon, my phone was buzzing with calls from reporters, family members, and former friends demanding explanations, apologies, or retractions. My mother called first, her voice a mixture of rage and panic. "Scarlett Elizabeth Montgomery, how dare you? How dare you destroy your father like this? He is in the hospital right now because of what you have done. Are you happy? Is this what you wanted?" I had been prepared for. This call had rehearsed my response with my own therapist during the weeks leading up to the charges being filed. "Mom, I did not put Dad in the hospital. The stress of his criminal behavior being exposed put him there. I did not steal $8 million from our family. I did not forge documents or create fraudulent companies. I simply refused to continue covering up his crimes." But my mother was not interested in logic or accountability. "You are dead to me," she whispered before hanging up the phone. "You are no longer my daughter." The words should have devastated me. 6 months earlier, they would have sent me spiraling into self-doubt and desperate attempts at reconciliation. But I had been doing intensive therapy work during the investigation process, and I finally understood that my mother's love had always been conditional on my willingness to sacrifice my own well-being for the family's comfort. The most challenging conversation came with Mason, who drove to my apartment that evening looking haggard and defeated. "Scarlett, I need you to understand something," he said, slumping into my kitchen chair like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. I had no idea about any of it. The gambling, the stolen money, the forged documents. I swear to you, I thought Dad was just successful. I studied my brother's face, looking for signs of deception, but finding only genuine confusion and pain. "Mason, I believe you. But what I need you to understand is that Dad made me the family scapegoat specifically so that none of you would look too closely at what he was doing. Every time he called me irresponsible or emotional or incapable, he was deflecting attention away from his own behavior." Mason was quiet for a long time, processing the implications of what I had said. Finally, he looked up at me with an expression I had never seen before. Respect mixed with something that might have been awe. "You know what the craziest part is?" he said softly. "All these years I thought Dad was grooming me to take over the family business. Turns out there was no business left to take over. He spent my entire life preparing me to inherit a lie." The conversation with Mason marked a turning point in our relationship. While my parents and extended family had essentially excommunicated me, my brother began the difficult process of accepting the truth about our father's crimes and his own unwitting role in the family mythology that had enabled them. But the most surprising development came 2 weeks after the charges were filed, when I received a phone call from my cousin, Rebecca. Uncle Charles's daughter, who had always been one of my harshest critics at family gatherings. "Scarlett," she said, her voice uncertain but determined, "I need to tell you something. Tell you. After the news broke about Uncle Richard, my dad has been acting really strange, really paranoid. And I found some documents in his home office that I think you and the prosecutors need to see." It turned out that my father's criminal enterprise was even larger than we had initially discovered. Uncle Charles had been involved in some of the property frauds, serving as a fake buyer for several transactions to help disguise the true nature of the sales. The investigation that began with my grandmother's documentation was expanding into a full-scale examination of decades of family financial crimes. As I prepared for what would certainly be a highly publicized trial, I reflected on how fundamentally my life had changed since that night at the family dinner. The scared, approval-seeking daughter who had walked into that room 6 months earlier no longer existed. In her place stood a woman who had learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable the people who hurt you. But nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to discover about the true scope of my family's betrayal, or how deep the corruption really went. The trial of Richard Montgomery became the most sensational criminal case Charleston had seen in decades. Local news stations covered every development, and the courthouse steps became a daily gathering place for reporters hungry for the latest revelation about the fallen patriarch of one of the city's oldest families. But nothing prepared me for what emerged during the prosecution's case presentation. What we had initially believed was a 20-year scheme of financial fraud turned out to be a multi-generational criminal enterprise that had been operating for over 40 years. District Attorney Chen stood before the jury with a confidence that sent chills down my spine. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence will show that Richard Montgomery did not invent family financial fraud. He inherited it and perfected it. Documents recovered from the defendant's personal safe reveal that his own father, William Montgomery, began the systematic theft of family trust funds in the 1980s. The courtroom gasped audibly as she continued. The Montgomery family's reputation for successful real estate development was built entirely on stolen money and forged documents. Properties that the family claimed to have developed were actually purchased with funds embezzled from trusts established by previous generations. The defendant learned these criminal techniques from his father and expanded them into the sophisticated fraud scheme we see today. I sat in the gallery feeling like the ground was shifting beneath me. My grandfather, the man I had been taught to revere as the foundation of our family's success, had been a criminal. The entire Montgomery legacy was built on lies. But the prosecution was not finished. They called witness after witness who painted a picture of my father as a master manipulator who had spent decades perfecting the art of psychological control alongside financial fraud. Former business partners testified about deals where money simply vanished. Bank employees described suspicious transactions that they had been pressured to overlook. Most damaging of all, they called Miss Dorothy, my grandmother's housekeeper, whose testimony about overhearing conversations revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. Mr. Montgomery would often take calls in Miss Rose's study when he thought she was napping. Miss Dorothy testified, her voice shaking but determined. I heard him talking about cleaning up loose ends and making sure the old woman doesn't ask too many questions. He was planning to move her to a nursing home so he could have complete access to her accounts. The revelation that my father had been planning to institutionalize my grandmother to gain control of her remaining assets felt like a physical blow. This was not just greed. It was calculated cruelty directed at the woman who had given him everything. During cross-examination, my father's defense attorney, an expensive Charleston lawyer named Jameson Wade, attempted to portray him as a victim of gambling addiction who had made poor choices but never intended to harm his family. The strategy backfired spectacularly when the prosecution introduced evidence of my father's detailed planning and sophisticated money laundering techniques. Your Honor, District Attorney Chen said, presenting a binder thick with documentation. These are the defendant's own notes detailing how to forge signatures, how to create false documentation, and how to manipulate family members to avoid detection. This was not the impulsive behavior of an addict. This was the calculated criminality of a career fraudster. The notes were devastating. Page after page of my father's handwriting outlining strategies for maintaining his fraud. Most sickeningly, there were entire sections dedicated to managing family perception that detailed how to undermine my credibility, how to position Mason as the responsible heir, and how to manipulate my mother's emotions to maintain her loyalty. One passage read aloud in court made me physically ill. Scarlett continues to be the weak link. Her emotional nature and need for approval make her susceptible to guilt manipulation. But her career in therapy means she may eventually recognize the psychological tactics being used. Must continue to undermine her confidence and position her as unstable to family members. If she ever discovers the truth, her credibility must be so damaged that no one will believe her accusations. I realized with crystal clarity that my father had not just stolen my inheritance, he had stolen my entire sense of self. Every insecurity I had carried every moment of self-doubt, Every time I had questioned my own perceptions had been deliberately cultivated by a man who saw his own daughter as a threat to be neutralized rather than a child to be loved. The prosecution's final witness was Rebecca Torres, the forensic accountant who had spent months unraveling decades of financial crimes. Her testimony was methodical and devastating, walking the jury through bank records that showed how money had flowed from legitimate family accounts into gambling losses, luxury purchases, and payments to co-conspirators. The total amount stolen from Montgomery Family Trust's estate accounts and investment funds over the past 25 years, she testified, is approximately $12.7 million. This does not include interest investment returns that would have accrued or property appreciation that was lost due to illegal sales. $12.7 million. The number hung in the courtroom air like an accusation. My entire family's generational wealth gone. Money that should have secured my children's education, that should have funded charitable foundations, that should have preserved a legacy for future generations. All of it fed into slot machines and poker tables in Atlantic City. But perhaps the most shocking testimony came from an unexpected source. Uncle Charles, who had been granted immunity in exchange for his cooperation, took the stand and revealed that the criminal conspiracy had extended even further than anyone had imagined. Richard convinced me that the family money was just sitting there earning nothing. He testified, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the courtroom. He said we could borrow against it temporarily for some business investments, and no one would ever know. But then the investments failed, and he said we needed to cover our tracks by selling some properties. It kept escalating until we were in so deep that backing out would have meant admitting to crimes we had already committed. Uncle Charles's testimony revealed that several family properties had been sold to shell companies he controlled, with the proceeds split between him and my father. The beach house in Kiowa Island, that we thought the family still owned, had been sold 3 years earlier. The mountain cabin in Asheville was gone. Even some of the commercial properties in downtown Charleston that formed the supposed foundation of our real estate empire had been liquidated. As I listened to the parade of witnesses describe the systematic destruction of everything my family had built over generations, I felt something unexpected: relief. For the first time in my life, I was hearing the truth about my family, and while it was devastating, it was also liberating. I was not crazy. I was not the problem. I had been living in a carefully constructed lie, designed to hide decades of criminal behavior. When the prosecution rested their case after 2 weeks of testimony, the evidence was so overwhelming that my father's defense team requested a recess to consider a plea agreement. But I knew my father well enough to know that he would never admit guilt, even when faced with irrefutable proof of his crimes. The defense would present their case, but the empire built on lies and theft was already crumbling, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. The defense's case lasted exactly 3 days and accomplished nothing except further damaging my father's credibility. Jameson Wade, despite his reputation as one of Charleston's most skilled criminal attorneys, had been handed an impossible task: defending the indefensible with evidence so overwhelming that denial bordered on the absurd. My father took the stand in his own defense, a decision that his legal team had clearly advised against, but which his narcissistic personality could not resist. Watching him sit in that witness chair, still attempting to manipulate and control the narrative, even as his world collapsed around him, provided a masterclass in the psychology of a career criminal who had never faced real consequences. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone he had used to dominate family conversations for decades. "I am not a perfect man. I have struggled with gambling addiction, and I have made financial decisions that I deeply regret. But I never intended to hurt my family, and I certainly never intended to commit the elaborate crimes the prosecution has described." District Attorney Chen's cross-examination was surgical in its precision. She walked him through bank records, forged documents, and his own handwritten notes with the methodical patience of someone who had spent months preparing for this moment. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, holding up a property deed with his forged signature, Can you explain to the jury how your gambling addiction caused you to forge your deceased father's signature on this document, dated 3 years after his death? That was a mistake. I was not thinking clearly because of the stress of my gambling problems. I see. And this mistake happened 47 times over the past 15 years according to the evidence we have presented. Would you say your gambling addiction made you particularly prone to making the same mistake repeatedly? The questions continued relentlessly, each one exposing another hole in his defense, another attempt at manipulation that crumbled under scrutiny. When she presented his notes about managing family perception and undermining my credibility, his composure finally began to crack. "Mr. Montgomery, you wrote, and I quote, 'Scarlett's emotional nature makes her susceptible to guilt manipulation.' Can you explain to the jury what you meant by that?" For the first time in my life, I saw my father rendered speechless. He sat there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, unable to craft a lie that would explain away his own written words. I do not recall writing that." You do not recall writing 17 pages of detailed notes about how to psychologically manipulate your own daughter? No, someone else must have written those. District Attorney Chen smiled the cold smile of a prosecutor who had just secured a conviction. "Mr. Montgomery, are you suggesting that someone else forged these notes in your handwriting in your personal safe, in your locked home office as part of an elaborate frame job designed to make you appear guilty of crimes you did not commit?" The jury's verdict came back after less than 4 hours of deliberation. Guilty on all counts. 37 felony charges including fraud, forgery, embezzlement, racketeering, and conspiracy. The judge sentenced him to 22 years in federal prison with the possibility of parole after 14 years. But the legal consequences were only the beginning of my father's downfall. The civil lawsuits began immediately. The IRS launched their own investigation into decades of unreported income and tax evasion. The South Carolina Real Estate Commission revoked his license and opened their own inquiry into every transaction he had handled over the past 20 years. Most devastatingly, the family's social destruction was swift and complete. The Charleston society that had once embraced the Montgomery name now treated it like a contagious disease. My mother, who had spent her entire adult life building and maintaining social connections, found herself completely ostracized. Former friends stopped returning her calls. Charitable organizations removed her from their boards. Even our family's longtime membership at the country club was quietly revoked. Mason handled the family's disgrace better than I had expected. During one of our weekly coffee meetings that had become a source of mutual support, he reflected on how the experience had changed his perspective on everything. "You know what I keep thinking about," he said, stirring his coffee absently. "All those times Dad criticized you for becoming a therapist instead of joining the family business. He said you were wasting your education on something that would not make money. But it turns out, you were the only one who chose a career that actually helps people instead of hurting them." The irony was not lost on me. While my father had been teaching Mason to inherit a criminal empire, I had been learning to help people heal from exactly the kind of psychological trauma that our family specialized in inflicting. The restitution process revealed the true extent of the financial devastation. Of the $12.7 million stolen over 25 years, less than $800,000 could be recovered. The rest was gone, lost to gambling spent on luxury items that had depreciated or hidden in accounts that investigators could not locate. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came 6 months after sentencing, when I received a call from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division. Agent Martinez explained that my father's case had provided them with leads on a larger investigation into casino money laundering operations. "Miss Montgomery, your father's detailed records of his gambling activities have helped us identify patterns of money laundering at several casinos. We believe his information will lead to significant prosecutions of organized crime figures who have been running illegal gambling operations for decades." So my father, in his obsessive need to document everything, had inadvertently provided law enforcement with evidence to bring down the very criminal network that had enabled his addiction and facilitated his crimes. Uncle Charles received a 5-year sentence for his role in the conspiracy, but his cooperation had helped prosecutors uncover the full scope of the fraud. Several other family members faced civil lawsuits and financial ruin, but none faced criminal charges due to lack of evidence that they had known about the illegal activities. My mother never spoke to me again after the sentencing. She moved to a small apartment in Columbia and took a job as a receptionist at a dental office, the first job she had held in over 30 years. Mason reported that she remained bitter and convinced that I had destroyed the family out of spite rather than seeking justice for decades of criminal behavior. But I was no longer seeking her approval or anyone else's validation. The scared, insecure daughter who had desperately wanted her father's respect was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable the people who hurt you. The criminal empire that had masqueraded as a respectable family business for 40 years was completely destroyed, and justice had finally been served. 2 years after my father's conviction, I stood in the renovated downtown Charleston building that now housed the Montgomery Center for Financial Abuse Recovery, a nonprofit organization I had founded using the recovered assets from my grandmother's estate. The irony was perfect. The family money that had been stolen to fund decades of criminal behavior was now being used to help other families heal from similar betrayals. The center provided free therapy services for family members who had discovered financial fraud, committed by loved ones' legal referrals for complex cases, and educational programs about recognizing the warning signs of family financial abuse. In our first year of operation, we had helped over 200 families navigate the devastating discovery that their trusted relatives were thieves. "Miss Montgomery," said Dr. Lisa Chen, the therapist I had hired to run our family counseling program, "I wanted you to know that the Hartford family case reached a positive resolution today. The daughter finally pressed charges against her mother for stealing her inheritance, and they recovered almost 60% of the missing funds." These success stories had become the fuel that powered my work. Every family that found justice, every victim who reclaimed their agency, every criminal who faced consequences, they all validated the choice I had made to speak truth instead of protecting lies. Mason had become one of my strongest allies in this work. After losing his expected inheritance and being forced to build a life based on his own merits rather than family wealth, he had discovered talents and strengths he never knew he possessed. He now worked as a financial advisor, specializing in helping families protect their assets from internal fraud, a career path that would have been unimaginable when he believed he was destined to inherit a criminal empire. "Scarlett," he said during one of our monthly board meetings for the center, "I need to tell you something I should have said a long time ago. When Dad used to criticize your career choice and call therapy playing with crayons, I went along with it because I thought it made me look more serious by comparison. I am sorry for not defending you, and I am sorry it took discovering his crimes for me to realize that you were the strongest person in our family all along." The apology meant more to me than Mason probably realized. For years, I had believed that my family's dismissal of my career reflected some fundamental flaw in my character or judgment. Learning that their criticism was part of a deliberate strategy to undermine my credibility had been both devastating and liberating. My therapy practice had grown exponentially as word spread about my own experience with family betrayal. Clients sought me out specifically because I understood the unique trauma of discovering that the people who should have protected you were actually predators. There was something powerful about working with a therapist who had walked the same dark path and emerged stronger. But the most unexpected development in my new life came from a source I never could have predicted. My relationship with District Attorney Sarah Chen's brother David, an investigative journalist who had covered my father's trial for the Charleston newspaper. What began as professional interviews about family financial fraud had evolved into a deep friendship and eventually into love. David understood the importance of truth-telling in a way that most people could not. He had spent his career exposing corruption and holding powerful people accountable for their actions. When I worried that my family's criminal history would taint any relationship I tried to build, he reminded me that I was not responsible for my father's choices. "Scarlett," he told me during one of our early conversations about our growing feelings for each other, "you did not inherit your family's corruption. You inherited their victims' need for justice. There is a difference between being shaped by trauma and being defined by it." We had been engaged for 6 months, and our wedding was planned for the following spring, in the garden behind the Montgomery Center. A ceremony that would represent not just our union, but the transformation of a family legacy from shame to healing. The extended family remained largely estranged from me, though I occasionally received updates through Mason about their various struggles with the aftermath of the scandal. Most had lost significant money and social standing, and several marriages had ended as the stress of public humiliation and financial ruin took its toll. But I had also gained something unexpected: a chosen family of people who valued truth over comfort and justice over peace. The staff at the Montgomery Center, the clients who trusted me with their stories, the legal professionals who worked with us to pursue family fraud cases. These relationships were built on authentic foundations rather than obligated loyalty. The center's success had attracted national attention, and I found myself speaking at conferences about family financial abuse, consulting with other organizations, starting similar programs, and even testifying before state legislative committees about the need for stronger laws protecting family members from financial exploitation. During one such testimony in the state capitol, a representative asked me whether I ever regretted pursuing criminal charges against my father, instead of trying to resolve the matter privately within the family. "Representative Johnson," I replied, thinking about all the families I had worked with who had suffered in silence to protect family reputations. "My father stole more than money from our family. He stole our ability to trust, our sense of security, and our belief that love and loyalty were mutual commitments rather than one-sided obligations. The only regret I have is that I waited so long to recognize that enabling his behavior was not protecting our family. It was betraying his future victims." 3 months ago, I had received a letter from my father in federal prison. It was the first communication from him since his sentencing, and I had debated for weeks whether to read it. When I finally opened it, I found not the apology I had once desperately craved, but more manipulation and attempts at emotional blackmail. He wrote about his failing health, about how lonely prison was, about how he hoped I was satisfied with destroying an old man's life. There was no acknowledgement of responsibility, no recognition of the pain he had caused, no understanding that he was in prison because of his own choices rather than my vindictiveness. I read the letter twice, then placed it in my shredder. The daughter who had spent 28 years seeking his approval and fearing his criticism was gone. In her place stood a woman who understood that some people forfeit the right to forgiveness when they choose to be predators instead of protectors. As I write this story today, sitting in my office overlooking the Charleston harbor where my ancestors first arrived over a century ago, I am struck by how completely my life has been transformed by that single moment of choosing truth over comfort. The family fortune is gone, the social connections have vanished, and the legacy I thought I was protecting never existed in the first place. But what I gained was immeasurably more valuable: the ability to look at myself in the mirror with complete honesty, relationships built on authentic foundations rather than fear and obligation, and a career dedicated to helping others find their own strength in the aftermath of betrayal. Sometimes people ask me if I think about my family's reaction to this story, knowing that sharing it publicly will cause them additional pain and embarrassment. The answer is yes, I do think about it. And then I remember all the clients who have sat in my office describing how their silence protected their abusers while ensuring that future victims would suffer. Have you ever had to choose between protecting a family member and protecting their future victims? Have you experienced the devastating realization that someone you loved was not who you thought they were? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below about family loyalty versus justice. When does protecting someone become enabling them? If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about overcoming family trauma and finding strength in the aftermath of betrayal. Share this video with anyone who might need to hear that speaking truth about family abuse is not betrayal. It is courage. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable the people who hurt you. May you find the strength to choose truth over comfort, justice over peace, and your own well-being over others' convenience.